I want to thank our title partner, Channel Factory, who's been with us this whole year, who's going to be leading through this really important session as we start to wrap into the end of the day in this conversation around ethical advertising. Such a big topic as we think about creativity, ethics, and how you pull that together, especially in 2020. I can't wait to see how this session goes. Hey, Lauren.
Hello.
Hey, you ready to take this away?
Ready. Thanks, Rob.
Okay, Lauren. Okay, let me introduce Lauren Douglas. She's the SVP of Content Marketing at Channel Factory, and she's going to lead you through. Thanks, Lauren.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, everybody, for joining. So as Rob mentioned, we're going to chat through ethical advertising, brand safety, and brand suitability, and really how 2020 has changed everything from platform decisions to creative content and everything between. So I'm joined by three awesome panelists. I'm super excited to introduce them. I'm actually going to hand it to you to introduce yourself. So Matt, why don't you start us off?
Hi, Lauren, thanks for hosting. And I'm Matt Harrington. I'm the president and COO for Edelman.
Anthony?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Anthony Martinez, and I am the Senior Global Director of Digital Marketing and Media at the Coca Cola Company.
Awesome. And Joe? Do we have Joe?
I'm Director of Brand Safety at GroupM for the Americas region.
Excellent. Well, I'm super happy to have all three of you on here today, and especially it's so relevant for the three of you in your specific areas. Matt, I wanted to start with you because I know you work with some big clients like Unilever, and I kind of wanted to just get a sense from you of some of the pivots that you had to make earlier this year with, COVID-19, obviously, and the murder of George Floyd. Like, what was, from the communications perspective, I'd love your kind of behind the scenes insight there.
Yeah, I think, it's been a year where we've all had to be quite nimble and move rapidly because of the pace of news. And that's COVID, it's post George Floyd's murder. It's been navigating the recession. So to make certain that our messages are remaining relevant and compelling to our target audiences and stakeholders. And one example I think of this is when you think about ethical advertising, it's about how are you really ensuring that your advertising is values-based, values-informed. And at Edelman, we study trust, and 85% of those we surveyed this spring around the time of COVID are looking for brands to be reliable sources of information as well as creating community. And so this probably was most relevant when we were approaching Father's Day and we were activating for Unilever a campaign 2 years in the making for Dove. And it was around a documentary that Ron Howard's daughter had directed about fathers. And all of a sudden, post Memorial Day and in June, that didn't seem solely as the way to embrace the moment and the reality of the conversations that were happening in the country. And we pivoted very quickly to wanting to acknowledge the fathers who'd been taken, their lives had been taken through the loss of life through police action and or just other events in their communities. And particularly, we created in 10 days' time a campaign called Dad's Taken, it had advertising that was against social channels, but it also had a philanthropic component where people could donate in the run-up to Father's Day to help the economically challenged families who no longer had their husband or their father as part of the household and contributing to the household. So it was, I think, an instance where a brand recognized it needed to pivot rather quickly to be tone sensitive to its consumers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in speaking of pivots, because I know we've had to make a lot of them this year, I mean, Anthony, from Coca Cola's perspective, you must have seen a lot as well this summer. I know you had some massive changes swinging in one way and the next. Would you mind just talking us a little bit about through what happened there and kind of what the conversation became at Coke?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, I mean, we've had our fair of pivots as COVID-19 hit in March, and we made a decision on the heels of that we were going to pause all of our marketing investments and media investments because we just didn't feel like it was the right time and space to be advertising, and that we could make a better and bigger impact on our consumers and our consumers' lives and communities in general by taking money that we would have otherwise put into marketing and advertising efforts and putting it back into the community in other ways. So that was one of the bigger decisions that was made very early on in March when COVID-19 started to really hit the marketplace. But then on the heels over the summer, with the killing of George Floyd and a lot of the other social unrest and the protests that took place, we took a step back and we decided that we needed to take a pause on advertising on many of the social platforms, more to reflect on our own policies and our own processes and decision making around why we were in these environments. Should we be in these environments? Were they appropriate for us as a company and as a brand? So our CEO took a very strong stance and kind of in a very emotional town hall setting. I would say probably one of the best town halls we've had as a company, had come out and just made the statement that he just didn't believe that there was any reason for there to be hatred or harmful content being spread on social platforms or on any platforms for that matter. And basically just made the decision that we were going to pause and just evaluate our own decisions and where we were showing up as a company. So that took place in July. And for the better part of the summer up until very recently, we were paused across all platforms from Facebook to Twitter to LinkedIn to YouTube, as we kind of went through a process of defining our own set of principles and policies that would help to inform what we felt we could be comfortable with in going back. And so that was quite a process that we went through over those months.
And you mentioned the other day when we were speaking, you thought about how to live your own principles and how to live Coca Cola's principles and how to reflect that in your media investment. I'd love to just understand a little bit about what that conversation was like and how did you ladder your principles up to your media investment?
Well, we last year I published something called the Responsible Digital Media Principles, and they're publicly published. If you search the Coca Cola website, you'll find them. And they were just kind of a simple 3 or 4 statements, if I'm remembering off the cuff here, around wanting to support environments that ensure quality. And we kind of define quality, environments as environments that are not spreading falsehoods or misinformation. We said that we want to make sure that we're environments that protect people and meet our values as a company. So we didn't want to be with partners that are, maybe doing unsavory things with consumer data. And we had 2 or 3 other things that we kind of put on paper and just said that these are our values and these are the things that will start to filter our decisions as to when we're advertising in certain environments or not. And they kind of built off of another body of work that we had, which was the responsible marketing policy, which talks to how we intend to behave as a brand marketer, a CPG marketer, as it relates to advertising to children or not advertising to children, and other things. And so it kind of built on this body of work. And so we kind of we had something to stand on when we came up with these additional principles. And the additional principles were more specific to social media platforms and user-generated content. And they were trying to live our values, which are around making a difference in the communities that we're in, and ensuring that we're not showing up in places that were spreading things like hateful and harmful content. And so we created some very clear expectations that we were going to have for platforms. And they're very much in line with industry standards like the Global Alliance for Responsible Marketing or Media, GARM, and kind of use that as some of the foundational work to inform those policies and processes decisions that we would make in terms of when we would return back to these platforms.
So really creating a brand suitability strategy. And I assume you did it by brand, right? Because not each brand is created equal.
Actually, no, we didn't do it by brand. We kind of believe that, you know, there's a baseline when it comes to brand safety, and there's kind of this baseline company need, right? Whether or not it's Minute Maid or it's Sprite, like these things are going to reflect back on the company reputation. So you've got to have some standard, call it lowest common denominator, that applies across every brand, everywhere we operate, in every part of the world. And this is something that's not going to change. Now, we allow brand marketing teams and countries to kind of go above and beyond these things based on the cultural norms or the brand norms. And that's where you start to wade into things like, is this suitable for a brand versus it being right for the company? So a lot of the decisions that we were making, that I was making, were not decisions on a brand by brand basis, but essentially attempts to get the company on one standard definition of what we mean, so that we don't, you know, I'm worried about the market cap of Coca Cola, right? And the company's reputation, not necessarily what's going on with Sprite or with Fanta. Not that those things aren't important, but those things will reflect and have a greater impact on the total company if we don't kind of have some kind of standards that we're all following, no matter where we are and what brands we're operating on.
Makes total sense. Joe, I would love your input on that. I know you're overseeing multiple brands, and you know you have to sort of walk that line as well. Brand safety, what's suitable for this specific brand versus what's safe and suitable for across the board. So I'd love you to weigh in there on your perspective. Joe,
Sure,
I think
Lauren.
you might be able to, oh, there we go.
Yeah. It's interesting because you know, we've been focused on brand safety at GroupM for 10 or 12 years now. And 7 or 8 years ago, when we started talking to clients about things like non-viewable ads and harmful content and terrorist videos on YouTube, we used to have what we called "you mean to tell me" meetings. You mean to tell me brands are running opposite harmful content? And the amazing thing is that doesn't happen anymore. You know, responsibility principles, frameworks, the things that our clients have done and the entire industry that have done to sort of honestly prepare for 2020 have been amazing groundwork, so that we were able to respond when things like COVID and the social justice phenomena came about, to basically have contingency plans ready to move forward in the face of the challenges that we've seen. So we've actually seen very wide adoption of what Anthony was talking about in terms of aligning corporate brand values with media placements and holding accountable those who can't deliver on the ethical environments.
Absolutely. And I assume that work is done in partnership with brands like GARM and the 4As, and is that correct?
Absolutely. Yeah, the 4A's Advertiser Protection Bureau was created in 2018, GARM in 2019. Trustworthy Accountability Group's been involved in this space for a while. Now with their merger with GroupM, they'll be more focused on contextual. So it's really sort of a groundswell of emphasis on not only brand protection, but consumer protection. You know, when we think about GARM right now, 3 of the top four criteria that we're talking to the platforms about are about consumer protection. There's one, which is adjacency management, third-party control, which is very focused on brands. But other than that, It's about cleaning the supply, because if you clean the supply, the downstream benefit will accrue to the brands as well.
Absolutely. That makes tons of sense. Matt, I'd love you to hop in a little bit on, when we spoke the other day, you kind of mentioned that the tone was really important, and not only the tone, but also where you're thinking about putting your certain messages, what is appropriate, what isn't appropriate. I'd love you to weigh in a little bit, just kind of going back to some of your earlier examples of how you thought about that. How do you match up the tone with the placement?
Yeah, so I'll come to that. I just wanted to acknowledge what Anthony shared in terms of Coca Cola's thinking about holistically their values be reflected into each respective brand, and not having each have their own approach. I think that's reflective of consumers now being so much more sophisticated about wanting to know who the brand, what company the brand is part of. And there's no separation, I think, any longer between the brand and the parent. And I think J&J has been on this journey. Unilever certainly has been on that journey, where the sustainability message that Unilever signed up to globally is something that is from center, permeates down through the brands. To come to your question on the tone, I think that all of our experiences have been in the last 8 months, sort of in real time, realizing that in order to connect to our stakeholders, we needed to meet them where they're at, and acknowledge what they're stressed about, worrying about, or caring about. And so the messages needed to be increasingly empathetic, as well as I think mindful on solution, as opposed to solution to a particular problem, and where your product sat in that mix. And I think that's really what we've seen playing out with our clients across the board.
Great. Joe, actually going on to something that Matt just said, I was thinking a little bit about, what is okay when you think about tone? What is okay today versus what wasn't okay? We've talked about like news stories or certain publishers that perhaps have, I know there's been a lot of conversation about overly keyword blocking or overly blocking certain types of content. How do you think about, tone and message when you think about also wanting to fund, certain types of content? I'd love your thoughts there.
Sure. Well, I think we've seen a dramatic difference in creative over the course of 2020 to reflect the social discourse. And I think marketers have always been good about that. Marketers have always reflected the times to show their brand in a reasonable light in the environment. But when it comes to things like news, we do feel a responsibility to support legitimate, credible news environments. And it's interesting that the tools are very often blamed for overblocking or for limiting opportunity. But in many cases, it's the tools that enable clients to take advantage of the opportunities that are out there. And keyword blocking is sort of 10-year-old technology that still exists. There's no question keywords are still used. But we've seen over the course of 2020 about a 30% reduction in exact match keyword usage because of some of the work we've done internally. And again, the tremendous attention that our clients are paying to this kind of stuff. So we're going in the right direction. The semantic analysis tools enable us to play in pools and play in environments that otherwise you might avoid completely. So we're trending in the right direction.
That's great. Anthony, I have a question for you. Who on the team is responsible for coming up with, the ethical advertising strategy and who's in the room having these conversations when you're making these decisions about how to pivot quickly or where to invest today versus in the future?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really a cross-functional team. And this year has been, because of, I think, some of the issues that have come up, this year has been a bit different in a good way. I think historically we haven't had the same level of attention that we now have as a company. And, just the fact that this year I had at least 5 different meetings with our senior leadership team, right? So CEO, COO, like we had never been in a room to talk about the issues of contextual adjacency, brand safety, brand suitability. Those really weren't conversations that we were necessarily having at that level before this year. That's not to say that they weren't happening. They were just happening with a different audience. And so I think what I've been most excited about is the fact that we've really captured the attention, and that there's an understanding at a very senior level within the organization on why this is important. And it's important, due to the impact that it can have on the company's reputation, but also it's about living our values and our principles. And, that means that we have to have some level of agreement, and those values and principles are very much defined by our senior leaders. And it's our job to kind of interpret them and put them on paper and help them understand the nuances between some of the decisions. But to be specific to your question, I mean, I'm working across our public affairs team. Our legal team is in the room. I'm obviously there from a media and marketing standpoint. And then sometimes we'll also pull in different team members from local market teams, right? Because what might make a lot of sense in the US will sometimes make no sense in another market, right? If I'm in a market that's in the Middle Eastern, North Africa region, some of the decisions that we're making or some of the policies we're trying to put into place just won't make sense in those markets. So really taking that global perspective so that, when we're putting something on paper for the company that's meant to create a standard, and that we're understanding all of those different cultural nuances that might be at play when interpreting those policies. And that's a challenge, right? Because it creates a lot of, we've got a certain culture and political culture here in the US that doesn't play out in every part of the world, right? When you go to China or Egypt, that's not the same. And you have to be able to wear that hat in all of those markets when you're creating some of these policies.
Yeah, I can't imagine the global complexity of that scenario. It must be very tricky. So I want to pivot a little bit. I know when we spoke the other day, you mentioned that Coca Cola had reinvested in the early days of the pandemic into creating PPE and sanitizer. Could you tell us a little bit about what that was like, and kind of making that pivot, what that was like internally?
Yeah, so I mean, I was not so much on the front lines of that, so more on the receiving end of knowing a lot of those things. So I can't say what it was like, or I could imagine what it was like to make some of the changes for my colleagues in the field. But we've, as I said before, very early on, our global CMO Manolo made the decision that we were going to pause our advertising. And the decision was on the basis of, one, what we were seeing in China just from an economic standpoint. It just didn't seem to make sense for us to continue to invest. I think there was a lot of news out there, like invest through a recession, like it's important to maintain your investments. Like our point of view was, this isn't a recession, it's a pandemic. Like people are scared and they're not out at home, they're not out and about, and they're not making investment decisions or buying product. Like there's a big difference between a pandemic and a recession. And so we made the decision to pull back on that and kind of begin to divert funds to other parts of the organization, like our Coca Cola Foundation, that can make community investments. Whether those community investments were investments that were being made in local communities here in the US or in communities around the world, where we can leverage our supply chain and logistics, where we can leverage our relationships to kind of get the things that people need in those markets, whether that's plastics and PET or, financial resources that are needed in a community of small businesses, to, product that we have that is necessary, like water. Getting bottled water into certain communities was necessary. So, really thinking about how we can contribute to the community and live, one of our values, which is making a difference, and doing that in a local way, in partnership with our bottlers, was important. And so that was a big shift took place.
Right. And I guess, on that point, like, did you talk about it? We're talking about ethical advertising. Is it something that you felt you should talk about in media?
Well, we didn't talk about it in that context, in that decision, right? So at that point, it wasn't, the conversation wasn't so much what are the right or what are the ethical ways to advertise. It was more around, is this the right time to be pushing a message out there to buy our products? Right. Or can we do something that's more meaningful? Should we do something that's more meaningful for the community?
Sure.
And so it kind of made it a more binary decision of advertising or don't advertise. And if you're not going to advertise, what else can you do with the money to benefit communities? Now, we've come back into advertising environments slowly over the course of the last 8 months. First, really leaning heavily in channels like digital e-commerce, slowly have come back to other campaigns and other messaging that I think I'm really proud of. At least, one body of work that's here in the US right now, which is around togetherness, which I think is an important message from us. But as a company, it makes a lot of sense because it's rooted in our, in our history, right? If you go back into Coca Cola, optimism, togetherness, like these are things that are all rooted in what we are. And I think we've centered it in a place that makes sense for the brand and for the company. And, I think one of my pet peeves early on was kind of messaging that hit the marketplace that just kind of all looked the same, right? And it had that same tonality and it had no relevance to the brand that was doing the talking or the company that was doing the talking. And I think we wanted to avoid that. We didn't want to be just another brand out there saying the same thing. When we did come back on, we wanted to say something that was meaningful, but also relevant to who we are and to what we were, at the end of the day, what we're selling, right? As a company, we're selling a beverage, but that beverage goes better with meals, and it goes better when you're together with a diverse group of people, and that just made sense to us as a company.
Yeah, that's I love that answer. Last question, Matt, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about, I know under Unilever's Ben and Jerry's, and I know they were very outspoken, and there was, I'm sure, a lot from your end on the, social front that was done. I'd love just a little bit of behind the scenes background there, if you wouldn't mind sharing.
Yeah, well, I think it goes to your question about, when you asked Anthony, how fast did they move? Both Ben and Jerry's posted a quite a long, thoughtful piece on racial injustice in America. And they weren't sitting with it ready to go necessarily, but they were thoughtful about putting it together. PayPal equally wanted to step up to the moment, but they weren't going to do it just because everybody else was announcing checks and what they were doing. They took time to figure out how they could be substantive engaged in helping solve a problem. So PayPal ultimately announced a several $100 million donation to create financing in Black bank-owned enterprises and support that. And I think in both instances, there was not a rush to action, but rather a careful, considered engagement that ultimately is serving both of those companies and brands well in terms of their consumer authenticity.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Rob, were you you mentioned you were gonna ask the last question.
Hey, guys, hey, everybody. Yeah, just really great session. I do have one last question. Based on hearing this. We have an interesting day tomorrow, and as we'll hear in a later session, there's elections happen all over the world every single day. So just the fact that we have an election tomorrow is just a blip in time. When you think globally, it's everywhere, every day. But here's my question. During the last 6 months, what did you learn about how quickly you need to react to crisis? Was it, and if you had to do it over, did you react quick enough? Would you react quicker? Would you be a little slower? Would you take a minute? And that's to the general group, because all of you guys talk to advertisers. Speed to reaction. Do you think that, would you do anything differently in terms of reaction time?
Well, I'll take a first crack at this, a quick one, which is I think the reaction time differs whether it's internal or external. Internal, immediate engagement, incredibly important. And then to the point of the examples I just gave relative to PayPal and Unilever, more thoughtful consideration before engagement. You actually have the permission if the ultimate response is truly, demonstrating that you've been really thoughtful and authentic in doing that. And I'll just say we released survey data this morning. We surveyed Americans across the US last week, the majority of whom are looking for from their employers in the next several days, responsiveness in a nonpartisan fashion that just creates forums for honest and open discussion.
Joe, Anthony, reaction time, faster, slower, same? Did you learn something?
I think our leadership team did a fantastic job in the way that they engaged the community, the internal community, right? Shortly after, when things really began to take root, we've been having a far more regular cadence with our leadership team. So global town halls, and I remember there was just meeting after meeting, but not in an obtrusive way. It was the content was well thought of, and it was more about the dialogue that we were able to have internally as a company with our leadership. And it didn't feel like there was any delay in it, to be honest. I think as far as some of our external conversations go, I think, there's always a desire to be able to communicate things more quickly. And then in communicating those things more quickly, having the answers for our stakeholders in the field, like that, to me, that was the hardest thing. Like when we decided, it took us 48 hours from when our CEO made his announcement, when James said he wanted to pause all social media. It took us about 48 hours to figure out how we were going to operationalize that around the world. Right? Because he makes a statement, but then we had to actually go out and figure out what does that actually mean for everybody? What platforms does that include? What activity needs to stop? Is there any activity that needs to continue from a paid versus an organic standpoint? Customer servicing, does that need to continue and stop? And that took time, and I don't know that there was anything that we can do differently other than be even more responsive to the questions that were coming in at the time from everybody in the field in terms of how they would operationalize his statement.
Yeah, Joe, I'll get to you in a second, right? And it's a hard question because there is no right answer, right? There is no right answer. On some level, you want to get out early because you want to show you're being reactive and you're caring about your consumer. On the other hand, you can't argue with we took a minute because we wanted to get the message correct.
Yeah.
Right. So there really is no right answer, either way, how you go on this. But that's why I'm kind of just, kind of curious lessons learned. Joe, gave you the last word, timing, things that you've learned in terms of reaction time in a crisis.
Well, Rob, I'm too superstitious to say we've got it. We're ready. Whatever happens, we obviously nobody will ever be that ready because you can never tell exactly what you're going to face. But I think we're more ready. I think we've got more open communication. We've got more contingency planning. We've got more experience, more precedent. The verification vendors have a better idea of what we're looking for and what our clients are looking for. The social platforms have been more responsive, and they're ready to act. So I think we're in as good a place as we can be, and we'll take it as it comes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, we'll call that a win then for 2020, which, let's call that a victory. Well, thank you all. Lauren, thank you for leading this. And gentlemen, thank you for being part of the session.